Good afternoon, or if you're online, in the morning perhaps, or in the evening, happy to have you here. This is a seminar in the series of the Department of Epidemiology, and we have a great speaker today in a very timely topic, autism. And I give the floor to Henning Thiemeyer, because this is jointly organized with Maternal and Child Health of SBS. Dr. Thiemeyer.
Thank you, Bert. I'm very happy to welcome Eric Vermon. Very proud in this series of MCH seminars to finally have a child psychiatric epidemiologist speak here, and somebody who even sees himself as one. Eric was trained as a psychiatrist and medical doctor in France. He moved to the Maudsley, to the Rutter Group, where I think he got much of his training and mentoring. Later worked in Montreal in doing the autism clinics there, but also working one of my famous studies, the breastfeeding trial. I noticed him there as one of the authors. And recently, I want to make this short, moved to Oregon Health and Science University and is now Professor Emeritus. Eric, I'll tell you that briefly, is one of, when I was in high school, I had about 20 best bands and 20 best football players. When I got older, I had 20 best psychiatric researchers, and Eric is one of them. Needless to say, he's stayed in that top league for many, many years, so I'm very proud to have him speak to us. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here with you in this particular time, difficult moment. And I had to change a bit the content of my talk. What happened 3 weeks ago, there was a release of the new CDC report on autism. At the same time, there was a conference of the new HHS secretary, which really aired a lot of misinformation and misinterpretation about this report. So as a group of scientists, we formed a coalition, and we are trying to fight back a certain number of misconceptions which are circulating and trying to. So today I thought I would expand in my talk this part, which is reviewing the CDC report and trying to really tackle the misinformation which have been presented and are probably will be influential in the course of action in the next few months in this country. So as a result, I might shorten the last piece on the environmental risk factors, but we'll see. My disclosure, I've been very involved in the vaccine saga in autism in the early 2000s. I was an expert witness for the government of the US, in particular trying to debunk this idea that there is a form of autism which is induced by vaccines. And now I come back to a similar type of work with new litigations which are concerned with hypotheses which are not very well grounded in any science, but are making a lot of fluff in front of courts, which are basically claiming that autism could occur because of the baby food, the little pots that you buy that would contain too much heavy metals, and that would be a reason for autism. There is no much scientific basis for that, but that's what I'm doing now. Otherwise, my research has been funded by public institutes. So, first part is just like reviewing briefly the prevalence surveys of autism. I published a number of reviews. You can see here, this is the latest review, 165 studies. The first study was launched in England in 1966 by a guy named Lotter, and the rate of 4 or 5 children per 10,000 was what was proposed at the time, and for about 10-15 years that was what I learned at medical school at the time. But as you can see here, you have the rates of prevalence in these studies with the year of publications on the x-axis, and you can see there is a very gradual increase, a significant one if you want statistically, showing that the prevalence has increased since basically the 1990s, and we'll come back to that. I outline here 2 studies of in the US. All the other ones at the beginning of this period are in Europe. The 2 only studies that we have are are really, they are not epidemiological studies in a broader sense. The one on the left, Treffer, 1970, concerns children who were born in 1954 to 1964, roughly. At the time, the diagnostic criteria did not, the nosographies did not even include autism. So you can imagine that the rate that they found was, by definition, an underestimate. The reason I mentioned that is that this study and these two studies are used by some anti-vaccine people or people who are claiming that the epidemic is real. They use that as the origin, saying 50 years ago it was so low and now it's like this. And then if we do the division between the ratio of these two rates, it's 1,000 more. So the argument is based on a fault interpretation of the data, because these studies were not really properly conducted. When you look at the studies, the body of studies we have is extremely heterogeneous. There is no standardized way or standardized methodology to do an epidemiological survey of autism in any population. It all depends on the organization of the healthcare system, the social policies in terms of how to support kids with disabilities in schools, whether or not there is diagnosis on the ground or not. So all these factors play an important role, and the heterogeneity in the methods of the study is quite impressive. So it's hard to summarize them for this very reason. You can see here, when you look at this dotted line, which is a moving average, when it goes down from the top to the bottom, it goes slightly on the right, showing that as we go with time, there is an increased average rate of autism found in the world. But I think the point I want to make on this one is that, look, there are some incredible variations in the point estimates of the prevalence. So on the left, very low estimates are still found today in some countries, and then on the right you have like high estimates, like 2 or 3%, and so there is a wide variability. And if you look at the bar, which is a 95% confidence interval around these prevalence estimates, you can see there is also a variability in the precision of each of these estimates. So if we summarize briefly again, the range is enormous. In adults, there are a few surveys emerging. I will come back to them a bit later. So now we have some average rates in adult populations, which are around 1%, 2%. It's starting to develop now. An important fact in the history of these studies is that at the beginning, we had 70 or 75% of subjects who had intellectual disability in addition to have autism. Now, when you look at studies today, it's more like 35 to 40%. So the proportion of associated intellectual disabilities has decreased quite steadily over time. And the same in the adults. It affects 4 boys for 1 girl. The plausible range of prevalence is, I don't know, but 1 to 2% would seem reasonable, but there are outliers. As a resource, I just want to show you this Simons Foundation map, which is maintained by some people working with me and others. And we just update that, so you can find on this map studies, and you click on the dot, and you're going to have details about the sample size, the prevalence estimate. So that you can use that. And the CDC has a visualization tool that you can also access for the CDC-based studies. The CDC has started to do some surveillance of autism in the population of the US, and that started actually in 1996, but the real first survey was published in 2002, I think, and this was the population born in 1994. They decided to go on the children who are aged 8 in a particular area. In each survey, which is repeated every 2 years approximately, they recruit different sites in the country, 10 sites, 11 sites, 16 sites. The sites change from survey to the other, so the comparability of the rates is affected by the fact that it's not the same region we are staying over all surveys. And the way the sampling is done is not meant to be a representative sample. It's really convenient sample. So they go on states, and when the states have teams and infrastructure that can support the CDC effort, then they are in. But it's in no way a representative sample, and the CDC states that in all the reports. You see the limitation. These are not nationally representative estimates. The other thing, in terms of their method, initially they were doing, they go in an area and collect all the educational records, all the health records, like developmental evaluation centers and tertiary care hospitals and all that sort of stuff. And they look also at ICD codes released on particular children in that area who are age 8 on the year of the survey. And then they link them up, and then you have lay interviewers who are trained, and they were going through all the record of this child, David, education, health, and then they have triggers lists, which are basically descriptions, behavioral descriptions, which if they find one, that would be a reason to abstract the information on the child from all the data source and then put it in a single record that will be subsequently reviewed by another team. So it's based on, that's the methodology that they employ. The second step is these linked records are reviewed by a team which has expert clinicians which review everything and can score diagnostic criteria, DSM-4 or DSM-5 now. But they don't include in their method private schools, PCP, so the method is not entirely perfect, of course, and they wanted to maintain this methodology constant over time so that we could compare meaningfully rates from one survey to the other. But of course, I mean, life is life, and they had to change aspects of their methodology, which might impinge on the comparison between rates. And then, well, I explained that. So these are the results you see on the right. This is the latest report. We'll come back to that. 3.2%. You can see they started with a 0.7%, which at the time was one of the highest rate. We had the same in England. I'll show you that a bit later. So there is a kind of smooth, regular increase. In the latest survey, this is the box here, you can see that the sample size is quite enormous. This is quite precise. A lot of kids with HD, 3.4 boys for 1 girl in this one. The mean age of diagnosis is about 47 months, has not changed much in the US. And now you have this rate of intellectual disability, which is 39%. As I said, it has declined like everywhere else. The prevalence is now higher amongst the minority, you will see that. And they also survey 4 years old, and in the latest survey, in many sites of the CDC, the cumulative incidence at age 4 is already quite as high as the prevalence at the age, and sometimes higher. So you can expect that in the next survey, there are going to be more increase happening. This is the rate by ethnicity. So for a long time, the rates in the Hispanic and the African Americans were lagging behind the rates in the Caucasians, and then they started, and it crossed here, and then now it's actually slightly higher. There is some kind of mild association now with lower social class measured by house income and areas of social index of social vulnerabilities, but not in all sites. But that trend is new because in the past, at the beginning, in the US, there was an association with high social class amongst the white people, where, of course, which was interpreted in showing that more wealthy people had more access to diagnosis and services. Now this trend has reversed, which is probably a good thing in the sense that it might be a signal that there is a reduction of social disparities. The way they define autism needs to be examined with some critical sort of view. There is no assessment of the child. Okay, so there is no in-person direct clinical assessment of the child in the CDC. That's a very important thing. Many surveys rely on that, not the case. They did validation studies at one point, so they're saying that a child who had met the case definition in their record review, they interviewed with like an expert with the proper diagnostic tools, some of them, and to see if there should be agreement between the two. And the agreement was not as much as you would like to have. And many of the kids meeting criteria in this CDC approach are meeting criteria like partially. So they are falling in this group which is a bit ill-defined, which is called PDD-NOS, which is like not meeting full criteria for autism, but having some features of it. So that's something which needs to be borne in mind. The methodology was supposed to not change, but it did change. And like 3 years ago in 2018, they changed the way they define a case. Now, there is no longer the second step of review of all records by expert clinicians. We could like say, yes, he has autism. No, he doesn't have autism. Now, this step has been removed altogether. So it's all based on the combination of having an ICD diagnosis of a certain type or having an autism special education eligibility category or having in any record, medical record, the mention that there is an ASD diagnosis in the evaluation. So it's kind of a very different than what they were doing in the past. Whether it affects the rate, we don't have like direct evidence of that. You will need to have access to the data. But that has changed. So it's important to recognize. And then you will see there is a lot of variability within a survey between different sites, and I will come back to that because it's important for our discussion. Just for your knowledge, the CDC monitor the prevalence of autism with its methodology every 2 years. There is also in the US a source of information driven from this household survey. And these are surveys which are, the merit is that the sample size is large. They can draw a really nationally representative sample with all areas and people represented with known probabilities of selection. But the way it's done is like a surveyor goes and knocks at the door and says, ask this question, is there anyone in this household that a doctor has said has Asperger or autism? And that's it. It's yes or no, and then there is no further validation of the answer to this question, no checking of the record. So I didn't include that in my survey because I find the case definition, if you wish, in the surveys to be a bit too loose. And the other reason is that they have shown in these surveys that when they change the location of this question in the questionnaire, you can have actually a direct effect on the response of parents. So just by modifying the questionnaire designs, keeping the question intact, but just putting it in a different place, you can have a change in the prevalence. So for all these reasons, I tend to be more cautious about these things. Worldwide, you have surveys, it's a bit an old map here, but you have surveys mostly in Europe and in North America, as you can see. There are still deserts of epidemiology of autism in the world, Central Asia in particular, Africa, of course. South America is catching up. There is a new Chile study, which is good and coming up, but it's not, we don't have data everywhere yet. And I've been doing many of these studies or involved in different capacities in these studies, so I've traveled around. So I've been interested in looking at autism in different cultural contexts. I can tell you that today there is still a lot of countries where stigmatization on autism is very high. It's not, people don't know about autism, they don't want to know. It's a bad thing to have a child who has a disability, and autism is probably one of the worst. But when we go in this country where they say, well, we don't have autism, there is no service, there is no diagnosis, and you do a survey which is not relying on diagnosed children versus non-diagnosed, but you go and you evaluate children with your own tools, you find autism, and you find it with rates which are about the same, like around 1%. I've done study in Mexico. The only study we have was a rate close to 1%. In Qatar, we did that, 1.1%. So it's everywhere where you find it when you go in the population with the proper tools and methodology. There is no, in my view, evidence that there is any place in the world, a country or a region, where there is a high rate of autism or a very low rate of autism. If it was the case, it would be interesting to follow up for identifying potential risk factors, but there is none of that. And when I've seen these kids in different countries, what is very striking is that they look alike. I've done a lot of assessments with adults and reviewing videos, and there is not much difference in the phenotypic expression and profile of autism across culture. There are some variations in the way people evaluate eye contact in some cultures or joint attention. So we need sometimes to modify our tools to take into account the specific of the local cultural context, but more or less our tools work well, they are revalidated in these populations, and they seem to have the same properties and to not be thrown away by the culture in terms of their efficiency. So that's what I would say. Now, that was my brief review. Then I want to go to this CDC report, which was released 3 weeks ago. The last one, you've seen it, the bar on the right-hand side, 3.22% is the latest rate for the US. So the HHS secretary in his conference made a certain number of assumptions which are extracted from his conference. I had the excerpts. And so he says a number of things. He says, there is an epidemic. It's real. It's 83 times higher than what. We don't know how he did that, but I calculated that for him, and that's because he used one of these obsolete old studies I showed you on the first slide, the one which had like low, because it was almost zero, but you cannot divide by zero. So he took like something like 0 plus epsilon compared to now, and then you have like an increase which is 1,000 times or 83% time. So that's not, it's actually not proper. But he affirmed that there is deniers of the epidemic, so I guess I am part of that, and it cannot be due to a better understanding, the broadening of the concept of autism, better detection, better diagnosis, it cannot be, that cannot explain that. So let's review that, like step by step. Awareness. I'm going to tell you something of my own experience here. On the left, you see, these are studies I did in the mid-1980s in France. I reviewed thousands of records in the special education and health system, and we are looking at disability, trying to estimate autism. There was very few diagnoses of autism done by the child psychiatrist because the child psychiatrist establishment in France, largely influenced by psychoanalytical concepts at the time, had a definition of autism which was like Kanner. So they were kids who were extremely different, had no language, and there were very few who were diagnosed. When the child with autism was starting to talk, which happens quite a lot, they say it's no longer autism, it's post-autistic syndrome. It's symbiotic psychosis, childhood psychosis, disharmonic presentations, personality. There are all sorts of local idiosyncratic terminologies, and when I reviewed all these files and look at the behavioral descriptions in the file, I could, like with ICD-10, which was developing, and we could obtain some estimate of autism, which was not too ridiculous or not too underestimated. Fast forward, like 30 or 40 years later, I am in Kazakhstan. That's a few years ago. Just to let you know, you go there, 19 million people, there is practically nothing for autism. No services. There are just families who are starting to coalesce together to try to lobby their government for developing something for autism. There are just a few child psychiatrists in the country. They are the only one who can diagnose autism, and they don't diagnose autism often because they trained in Russia, and in Russia, autism in childhood schizophrenia, it's about the same kind of thing still, and therefore there is no really expertise and awareness of what is autism in current times. And therefore, they have no autism services and very few. So this is now changing because there are no political change, but the question of awareness is a big one. When you go in a country where there is no awareness, no tradition, no training of the professionals, you will find no prevalence of autism or very little. Second, the diagnostic concepts and criteria have changed quite a lot. So look at this, the first one, you look at the thickness of the DSM manuals over time. As you come closer to now, the DSM manuals get like thicker and thicker. And, but anyway, for autism, in 1968 it was DSM-2. There was the manual in use that in the studies, the red studies I showed you at the beginning. And there was actually no category for autism. So no wonder why there was no diagnosed kids with autism. It appears only in 1980 in DSM-3 as the term infantile autism. And then DSM-3 really started to approach more the introduce a developmental approach to the diagnosis of autism, which was much welcome. In DSM-4, we introduced Asperger disorder, which is a high-functioning autism in a different way. And now we got rid of all these categories. There was a category of PDD, or a spectrum of condition, with different subtypes, more or less severe. But the reliability between diagnostician in terms of saying it's Asperger or autism was not very good. We are all in good agreement for, is it an autism type condition versus not? That works well. When you were looking at within the autism spectrum, the subtypes were not very reliably defined and diagnosed. So the concepts have broadened enormously, and that is important. The way the study is devised and how active you are in terms of trying to find cases in the community or not influence the prevalence rates. On the top of this slide, you have, it's all the United Kingdom, and it's all 4 studies I took. I did 2 of them, but it was 4 at the same time. So the same country, same age group, more or less, and you can see the rates are varying from 10 to almost 60. So there is a 5 to 6-fold increase in the prevalence rate in the same country at the same time. And what explains the variation is the method. Here you have the low rate study is just a passive count of kids already diagnosed, which are in an administrative database. That's the lowest kind of prevalence that you could find. And then at the top, we did studies, and there are 2 studies done with a very proactive screening technique in the community, direct assessment with ADOS and ADI of the child, so confirmation of the case, but not relying on the child being previously diagnosed or not. And that really boosts the prevalence. And the same story for the US. You can, it's published, you can look at it later. So let's go back to this issue of, I won't do time was, because I switched off my phone, so. Okay, all right. Oh, all right. What I want to say is that in the CDC surveys, from the beginning to now, there is basically a 5-fold increase in the average prevalence rates. Fine. Now, if you look at this survey, the recent survey, you look at now. I'm looking at site-specific prevalence estimates. And look, the variation is 5-fold. In California, you have 5.3% is the rate. In Laredo, Texas, it's 0.9%. It's also more than a 5-fold variation. And in that survey, there is no passage of time. It's the same survey, the same year, same country, same age. And then in 16 different sites, you can have a rate which is here or 5 times higher. So given that there is such variability in site ascertainment, the 5-fold increase that you see over time between 2002 and 2025 is not particularly suggestive of an epidemic. Here, nobody interprets the data as showing that we should all go live in Laredo, Texas, because there is like it's a safe place to live, and then California or San Diego is a dangerous place for autism. So nobody is sad, and there are actually reasons. Like in California, they have a very intensive early screening program for kids 12 months of age called the Get Set program, and they have always the rates which are higher because of that program. And then in Pennsylvania, for instance, they have also often high rates. The reason is that in Pennsylvania, a child with autism can access Medicaid services and support irrespective of parental income. So there is for this very reason, it has been shown that the rates are influenced by this sort of social policy factors, etc. So we cannot impute like these 5-fold variations between the national rates to an epidemic, because we see it even in the same year of survey between sites. And this between site variations has been always found in the surveys, like I give you with that slide, but there was always high variability across sites in any CDC survey since the beginning. Do the diagnostic criteria specifically, ICD, DSM, when we use them, does that change? Well, there is this study, like on the top, it's a Finland study, interesting because he gathered, Mario Kielinen, got the whole data on this survey, and then he said, I'm going to apply different algorithm, and then I will compare ICD-10 DSM-4, which is the new, more broader definition of autism, compared to the old definition CANER. And by just comparing the two, nothing else changed. You have a 2- or 3-fold increase in the prevalence. So that's a direct demonstration that changing the diagnostic algorithm or criteria in itself has a direct effect on prevalence. In Denmark, they also changed over 1 year between ICD-8 and ICD-10, and that explained 33% of the increase in prevalence in that registry, which has 600,000 or 700,000 children. So that plays a role. Another factor, which we have called diagnostic substitution or diagnostic switching, is that there were children before autism became popular and before the fact to have a diagnosis of autism was actually a gateway to access services. The children were often diagnosed with other kinds of conditions. And in California, for instance, you see as autism rises over a period of 7 years, autism is rising, you have a decrease in the use of mental retardation diagnosis. These are group aggregated data levels, so we need to be a bit careful. But another follow-up study on the same data set showed that at the individual level, about 26% of children in the California dataset system were starting their support as a child with disability with a category which was then switched to autism a bit later in their individual trajectory. So same in British Columbia. I'll skip because it's 33% of people children switch to autism around 2000. This is study evidence of, in the past, children who were diagnosed with complex language disorders. And then this study by Dorothy Bishop, who is a language pathologist of the top level, had a very well worked out sample of language disorders, and then she reviewed them when they were becoming adults with an autism view and autism tools, and there were a new team reassessing, and up to 60% of these children were characterized as having pragmatic language disorder in particular, were now actually meeting criteria for autism. And she concluded herself that this switching was occurring. HHS or secretary said that it's not due to inclusion of less severe forms. Not true. You can see this is the slide of my review. In the previous studies at the beginning, 70% on average had intellectual disability. And in recent studies, the same analysis showed that, in fact, those who have disability is about 38%, which is like the rate of the CDC now. So this trend, I mean, you see the increase in the normal IQ kids in surveys is undebatable. I mean, it's happening. And the same in the CDC survey. I'll skip that because I think I'm running out of time. I just want to show you a couple of slides. Stigmatization. I did a study in South Korea with Kim and others. When I went there, the chief of child psychiatry had a big dinner with me and said, Dr. Fonbon, you know, we don't have autism in our country. No, very, very rare. And so we did a study with our unusual team. We did a school screening, which was the first thing. And we had a rate of 2.6%. And in fact, what happened, there was no awareness about autism. In the schools, you see, we had to train the teachers to what was autism and how to complete questionnaires because they really had no clue. And then the second thing is that children were misdiagnosed. So they were diagnosed with this category in psychiatry that we call reactive attachment disorder, which is basically used for children who have been raised deprived from maternal care or raised in an institution and have a behavioral phenotype which mimics to some extent autism, but is not autism, especially when you look at it longitudinally. So they were misdiagnosed. And the same in this country, for instance, the studies by Mendel show that for black children in particular are often when they are referred for developmental evaluation to diagnose autism, all these kids at the end were diagnosed with autism, 400 of them. But initially, the first diagnosis was not autism, disproportionately for the black population, and they were more often ascribed diagnosis of ADHD, oppositional disorder, conduct disorders, adjustment disorder, all sorts of non-autism diagnoses in about 25% of them. And then it was recognized to be autism later, but they were disproportionately affected by this misdiagnosis initially. And then the last point of HSS was, I shouldn't, Mr. Kennedy, he said, where are the adults? We don't see them. Well, we see them. There are new studies showing that the rates in the population of adults exist. You need also to take into account there is an increased mortality rate in autism, especially those who are severe with intellectual disability have an increased mortality rate of different causes. They have been often misdiagnosed, many children, and there are multiple studies looking at when they were psychiatric institutions, they were often there, not diagnosed, but diagnosed with schizophrenia and intellectual disability. In prison, you find a number of people who are high-functioning autism, Asperger. There are nice English studies doing that. In the US, you can see on the right corner, this is like based on 30 million subjects in Medicaid, and you can see that by, on average, now the rate is about 1%. But if you look by birth cohort, that's very different. The cohort, which is the youngest cohort, 18-24, is obviously has a higher level, and the increase is steeper. But even in the cohort who are older, like the increase is less in the adults who are between 55 and 64 years of age. But it's still 45% increase of diagnosis in this cohort over 8 years. And think of it. It means that a number of adults between 45 and 54 were diagnosed at that age with autism. You don't contract autism when you are 50. It's a childhood disorder. So if this is increasing, even not so much, but if this is increasing in this older, it means that they were misdiagnosed, if you trust the new diagnosis, of course. But, and there are all sorts of other factors, contextual factors. You can look at the slide, but there is a number of things happening, in addition to diagnostic concepts, like more the insurance, the mandate to private insurance to cover ABA therapy, the evidence of new treatment being available, the development of services. Now the American Academy of Pediatrics is arguing that normal pediatricians should be able to diagnose autism without specific tools. So there is a whole push for more diagnosis coming up. And it's very hard to assess the contribution of each of these factors, but they do operate as well. So I think I have to stop there, but this is almost done. So this is what he said, and when you look at the review I did, basically the answer to that is that, no, he was wrong on all these points. I left a question mark at the last one because I don't know where that came from when he said that, but my approach to it is that we see this trend, it's like a statistical test. You have this trend, and people say, there is an epidemic, a real increase. Okay, this is the alternative hypothesis. So before you accept this alternative, you need to reject the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis say there is this trend, but these artifacts are maybe accounting for this trend. Diagnostic, better awareness, better services, better access, less social inequality. All that together could explain the trend. I showed you that each of them individually, when we had this natural experiment, we could help us to disentangle in this increase the effect of one particular factor. Well, the increase was 30%, 40%. So if you add them all together, which we cannot, but it's not impossible to say that this could account for all of the increase, really. And I do believe that. But do I know it is the case? No, I don't know, because there is no study which can convincingly assess the joint effect of all these factors which operate they are overlapping factors and they operate at the same time. So it's very hard to do that. But if you look at the ingredient of this, it might well account for the whole. But given that we cannot really be sure that they do not account for all that they cannot account for all the trend, we cannot conclude that there is an epidemic unless we have really first rejected this null hypothesis with a proper say. So I think of it as a statistical test. I think that's the way to remember it. So this is for another talk. I know I have to stop, and you have constraints of your time, so I'll stop here. And, thank you for your attention. So.
Thank you very much indeed. Timely. Thank you. Any questions, comments,
this is
suggestions?
My last slide at the end of it, the second section. You can have fun with that.
If you would summarize, you had the ones you skipped, namely possible environmental toxins. What is in 2, 3, or 4 lines your summary there?
Yeah. I don't know. I just want to use one slide.
Yeah, it's very good.
Because it's okay. This is the one I used that slide for many years. I took these data sets from different countries like Denmark, England, Japan, USA, and you see there are for different reasons, different origins, but you see the rise in autism is occurring at about the same time, 1990. It's around that time that there was a big rise. Because of what? Because we changed the diagnostic criteria. ICD-10 was already in use in the late 80s, and then it was much broader, DSM-4 as well. We developed tools, diagnostic tools that we didn't have before. The ADOS and the ADI, for those who know these tools, were developed at that spot and they are now adopted everywhere in the world, but they are more dimensional. And we started to also recognize autism in kids who have normal language and cognitive development. So all these factors were playing a role. And if you look at this side, it's happened everywhere at the same time. So what would be the environmental toxin that might explain the rise in so many different contexts? Well, when I'm a bit facetious, I think, well, I have one, Mr. Kennedy. It is climate change or global warming, and maybe your administration should study that. That's kind of a bit of a joke. But no, so there is, you can see that the timing of this increase is not suggestive of something which would be operating specifically in a particular area. And, so that's the other thing, that we have a lot of evidence of genetic factors. Twin concordance is much higher in monozygotic twins compared to twin, 90% to 10% or 5%. That translates into an heritability estimates, which is about 85, 90%. Strong contribution of genetic factors at the population level. We've made progress on that. Now we have a list of genes which we know are responsible of autism in some families or are strong risk factors. And so that's where the progress has been in the last 20 years. And in terms of the search for environmental factors, there is a bunch of studies. So first, the vaccine and everything which is postnatal is to be considered with a lot of criticism, if you wish, but simply because now we have studies looking at the development of children with autism. The parents usually recognize the problems in the second year of life. When we do prospective studies of at-risk infants, we can see them with our eyes. At 10 months of age, we see the abnormalities emerging. And then we have a lot of other studies looking at biomarkers of autism, like extra fluid in the cerebral spinal area at 6 months of age. The cry of young babies, infant babies, who will be diagnosed at age 3 with autism compared to controls. When you analyze that blindly, you see immediately social communicative abnormalities very early in terms of the prosody is lacking in the cry is guttural, lacks communicative value. So there are a number of markers, behavioral, brain markers, which shows that autism is in progress, in development, in the first postnatally early. And therefore, if there is a place to search, it's during the pregnancy. And this is where now most of the people who are interested in these hypotheses are looking for. But it's obviously very hard to do because you have the case control aspects, which are the exposure assessment is always limited or difficult. And the prospective studies of needs like a sample size which are considerable because it's not a very common outcome, and you need repeated exposure assessments. And then where do you start? You have so many studies today which are association, which are significant, and people push their findings as if it was like we found something. And when you look at is there evidence of causality in this association, it really doesn't survive the test. And when we have studies well done, we use triangulation, like for instance, looking at one particular association, but looking at it with different designs, like sibling comparisons designs, negative controls, it all blows out. And the SSRIs, antidepressant taken by mother during pregnancy, all gone. Same for Tylenol. I can give you so many things which were hypes in the last few 15 years, which have been dismantled as causal explanations. So, and because of the genetic factors being so powerful, and these genetic factors are complicated, it's very complicated, but they influence a lot of behaviors of mothers during pregnancy. So, in my view, to look at environmental factors during pregnancy, if there is any, we're going to have to be designing studies which are genetically informative and get measurement of confounders in a real way. And currently, those who do environmental studies are just basically disconnected from the genetic research and do not really often incorporate in their studies ways to control for genetic factor, familial confounding, and all sort of things like that. So that's. Sorry, it was a bit long.
No question. Any further?
Quick question.
Yes, please.
You know, in the ASD, do we generally divide into familial or sporadic, subpopulations? The reason I ask is that if you compare, ASD with Duchenne muscular dystrophy.
To what?
Duchenne muscular dystrophy, DMD,
okay.
and also compared to ALS, when we, fine-tuning, find more and more the molecular biology, in the advance of the, spatial genomic and some others, and they pinpoint, hey, we find those, it can occur over 95% of time in sporadic, for instance, like TDP-43 protein, in ALS, and then suddenly, you could re-diagnose, find out the population who get that biomarker, and then I can put them into that kind of disease category or the definition. So I wonder, in the case of ASD, the complexity is more than 60 to 1,200 genes, engaged and involved in this, and then we lump them together. And
no, you're absolutely right. So and I'm not sure, I'm not familiar with DMD and AOS, but I think I understand the sense of the question. The genetic architecture is incredibly complex.
Yes.
So we have like rare variations, which is called we have de novo mutations, copy number variants. I don't know if you know all these things, but these are we found like de novo mutations. These are mutations which are not inherited from the parents, okay? And this is why you find the sporadic cases. You have a family, parents are normal, siblings are normal if there are any, and then there is a mutation in that child. That child will likely not reproduce. So but these are mutations which are rare, less than 1%, and they are usually very deleterious and associated with a very severe phenotype. And then we know like different ones and different genes. So they are not the same mutations in different families. And then there is a big group of which is more like common variations. So polymorphisms which are found in the normal populations and which are more common, like more over 1%. And we have started to look at that. They are the first genome-wide association studies which are starting to show some findings which need to be replicated, because we still do not have the numbers that we would want. So the largest cohort we have now is about 35,000 individuals with autism. We really need to go to 100,000 or more. But this is what we are doing now. In that common variations, we have found some genes that we know are inherited and could be are responsible for the high recurrence risk in some families. So I don't know if it answers your question. Probably not.
I hope so, because we have time.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
very brief.
Okay, I was wondering whether there are large sex ratio difference between males and females, whether you think that's more of a phenotypical difference in there by under diagnosis, so whether there's like a genetic basis for that.
Yeah, it's something. There is no final answer to that. There is a typical hypothesis which has some support, but not entirely recently, which is called the female protective effect, by which, if you have a number of genes, females are protected, and they need, for example, a higher threshold to go from normal to expressing the phenotype compared to males. Okay, and this is there are some data which are consistent with that. So, for example, if you have in a family the risk of, if you have a child who has autism already, the risk of having another child with autism is about 20% on average. Now, if the first child is a girl, which consistent with this hypothesis, she might have a higher loading of genetic factors, then the recurrence risk is higher in this family compared to if the first proband is a boy. So that's the type of consistent things. But there are also some findings which are going slightly, do not support it. So it's probably a mixture of factors. The issue of recognition of autism in females or not is debated. I think it's very trendy, very fashionable at this point in time. There are a lot of adult females which are volunteer for studies, on light phenotyping on the internet, and say they have autism because they feel a bit like they have problems with relationship. There is a bit of a dilution of the phenotype and of the diagnosis in recent studies. So a lot of things have been said about females being good at camouflaging, so they may have autism, but because they are better socially in general, they might mask their autistic symptoms. It's all under study. I think I don't see for me the masking or the camouflage or the underdetection in girls to be a major factor. It might have occurred, but there is a large study comparing girls and boys showing that there are a few differences. So girls are a bit better in terms of social communication skills, but they are. But it's not to an extent that would justify, for instance, to separate norms or separate cutoffs, because the differences are not that magnitude is not good. So, but it's an open question.
Dr. Van Boon, thank you for a superb seminar. Thank you very, very much.